Disclaimer: this story contains mature themes intended for adult viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. The first thing I remember is the silence. Not the peaceful kind, the heavy kind that settles into a room when too many emotions are trapped between three people who should never have ended up in the same moment. The desk lamp glowed softly against the dark wood of the study table, casting long shadows across scattered papers, a half-closed notebook and the edge of a glass that had been forgotten hours ago. The air felt thick, almost electric, like something inevitable had already begun and none of us had the courage to stop it. I stood beside the desk, pretending to focus on the documents in front of me. My fingers brushed the smooth surface of the wood, tracing invisible lines just to keep them from trembling. Behind me I could feel him close enough that the warmth of his presence settled against my back like a quiet storm waiting to break. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Some tensions live in the space between breaths. And then there was my husband. He leaned against the doorway of the study, arms folded, watching everything unfold with an intensity that made the room feel smaller. His expression was impossible to read, calm on the surface, but his eyes carried the weight of something deeper: suspicion, curiosity, maybe even something darker that none of us were ready to name. The moment stretched. A simple glance turned into something heavier. A passing touch lingered half a second too long. Every movement felt amplified, like the quiet ticking of a clock echoing through a cathedral. What should have been ordinary, three adults sharing the same space, had transformed into something charged and unpredictable. I didn't know when the line had been crossed. Maybe it started weeks ago with conversations that lasted a little too long. Maybe it began with the way he looked at me when he thought no one else noticed. Or maybe the truth was simpler. Some connections arrive uninvited, pulling people into an orbit they never meant to enter. My husband noticed. Of course he did. He had always been the kind of man who read silence better than words. The kind who sensed when the air changed, when a room held more truth than anyone was willing to speak aloud. Yet he didn't interrupt. He didn't leave either. He simply stayed where he was, watching carefully, as if waiting to see just how far the moment would go. The desk between us suddenly felt like the center of something dangerous. Every heartbeat seemed louder, every breath carried meaning. And the strange part was that none of us moved away. It was as if the gravity of the moment had already decided the outcome, pulling us closer to a confrontation none of us fully understood. Three people, three different storms of emotion colliding in the same room: desire, pride, anger, curiosity, and something sharper beneath it all. Power shifted silently in the glances we exchanged, in the tension that rose and fell with every passing second. Someone was going to break first. Someone was going to speak, or move, or reveal the truth hiding beneath all this quiet restraint. And when that happened, the fragile balance holding the room together would shatter. Because by the time the desk lamp flickered against the dark window and the silence stretched 1 second too long, we all knew this night was about to change everything. The silence finally broke with the faint scrape of a chair leg against the wooden floor. It was such a small sound, yet it sliced through the tension like a spark in dry air. I didn't turn around immediately. Part of me didn't want to see which of them had moved first, because whoever moved first would be admitting something none of us had dared say aloud. I kept my hand on the desk, fingers resting on the cool wood, grounding myself. My pulse had begun to betray me, beating louder with every passing second. "You're still working this late?" his voice asked quietly from behind me. It was a simple question, but the tone carried something deeper: curiosity, maybe even challenge. I let out a slow breath before answering. "I could ask you the same thing." For a moment there was a faint hint of amusement in the air, but it disappeared quickly. The room wasn't built for casual conversation anymore. Every word felt like it carried weight. Behind me I sensed him step closer, not enough to touch, but enough that the warmth of his presence brushed against my shoulders. My body reacted instinctively, a slight shift, a tightening of breath. I hoped no one noticed, but someone did. My husband. He straightened from the doorway, his arms slowly uncrossing. The movement was subtle, controlled, but the change in posture made the entire room feel different. His gaze moved from me to the man standing behind me, measuring something invisible. "You two look serious," he said calmly. There was no accusation in his voice. That almost made it worse. I finally turned slightly, enough to see both of them without fully facing either. The lamp cast golden light across the desk and up along their faces, highlighting the quiet tension carved into their expressions. "No one's serious," I replied, though even I could hear how unconvincing it sounded. For a moment none of us spoke again. The quiet filled with smaller details instead: the faint hum of electricity from the lamp, the distant sound of traffic outside, the quiet rhythm of breathing that suddenly seemed too loud in the enclosed room. Then something unexpected happened. My hand shifted on the desk, brushing against his fingers. It wasn't intentional. At least that's what I told myself. But neither of us pulled away immediately. The contact lasted barely a second, yet the sensation lingered like a spark traveling through my nerves. I could feel the awareness ripple through the room instantly. Even without looking, I knew my husband had seen it. Slowly, carefully, I pulled my hand back. The man behind me cleared his throat softly, his voice quieter when he spoke again. We should probably stop making this room feel like a courtroom. That earned a short breath of laughter from my husband, though there was no real humor in it. Interesting choice of words, he replied. Their eyes met across the desk, and something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't anger exactly, it was something more complicated, an unsteady balance of pride, curiosity, and a quiet test of boundaries. I felt caught between them, not physically, emotionally, like the center of a triangle no one wanted to acknowledge. I turned fully toward the desk again, trying to focus on the papers scattered there, but the words on the page had become meaningless shapes. My mind was somewhere else entirely, somewhere tangled between loyalty, curiosity, and a dangerous pull I didn't fully understand. Behind me I heard slow footsteps. My husband stepped closer into the room now, the doorway no longer holding him back. His presence shifted the air again, heavier this time, more deliberate. He stopped beside the desk, close enough that all three of us now stood within the small circle of lamplight. No one spoke, but the silence had changed, because now it wasn't just tension, it was anticipation, and the feeling that whatever fragile line had existed between us was starting to blur. The lamplight seemed smaller now that all three of us stood inside it. No one had stepped back. That alone said more than any words could have. The desk between us was no longer a barrier. It felt more like the fragile edge of something none of us fully understood. My husband rested one hand on the corner of the desk, his fingers tapping once against the wood before going still again. The sound was soft, thoughtful, like he was measuring the rhythm of the moment. You know, he said quietly, his voice steady, this room used to be the quietest place in the house. His eyes shifted toward me, then toward the man standing beside me. Now it feels crowded. The other man didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced down at the papers on the desk as if they might offer an easier subject to focus on. But his shoulders were tense, and the small distance between us had become impossible to ignore. I felt it too, the closeness, the pull, the dangerous curiosity of wondering what would happen if someone stopped pretending this was just another late evening conversation. I should probably go, he said after a moment. The words were calm, but they landed strangely in the room. No one moved to open the door. No one stepped aside. My husband tilted his head slightly, probably, but there was no urgency in his voice. I looked from one of them to the other, my heart beating faster with the quiet tension building again. It felt like watching two different storms meeting at the same horizon. He turned slightly toward the desk, reaching to gather a folder that wasn't even his. Our hands brushed again as he did. This time it wasn't as quick, just a light graze of fingers. Still, it was enough. I felt the warmth of his hand linger for a moment longer than necessary, and when our eyes met, something unspoken passed between us. A question neither of us dared ask. What if? That single thought felt dangerous. My breath caught before I could hide it. He noticed. I knew he did. His expression shifted, softening, almost uncertain, as though he were standing on the edge of a decision he had no right to make. For a heartbeat it looked like he might step closer. The air seemed to pause with him. Then he stopped himself. Not dramatically, not with a sudden movement, just a quiet restraint, like someone catching themselves before crossing a line they couldn't return from. My husband watched the entire exchange. His gaze was steady, unreadable, but there was something thoughtful in it now, like he was studying a puzzle rather than reacting to a threat. You two have known each other a long time, he said after a moment. The statement hung between us. Yes, the other man replied. A pause. Maybe too long, my husband added. No one argued with that. The truth was complicated. History has a way of weaving invisible threads between people. Old conversations, shared memories, moments that once felt harmless but suddenly looked different under a new light. The problem wasn't just what was happening now. It was everything that had happened before. Every glance that lingered too long. Every joke that felt slightly too personal. Every silence that held more meaning than it should have. I felt the weight of it pressing against my chest. Nothing's happening, I said quietly, though the words felt fragile the moment they left my mouth. My husband gave a slow nod. I didn't say it was, and somehow that made the tension worse. Because he hadn't accused anyone, he had simply acknowledged the possibility. The man beside me shifted his weight, running a hand through his hair like someone trying to steady their thoughts. We should stop this before it becomes something complicated, he said, but his voice didn't sound convinced. My husband leaned slightly against the desk, his gaze calm but piercing. Maybe, he said softly. Then his eyes flicked between us again. Or maybe it already is. The room fell silent once more, and this time the quiet wasn't just heavy. It was full of longing no one was brave enough to admit. The room had grown so quiet that even breathing felt too loud. The lamplight spilled across the desk and over our hands, casting long shadows that stretched across the walls like silent witnesses. None of us had moved for several seconds, yet everything felt like it was shifting beneath the surface. I could feel it in the air, that fragile moment when restraint starts to crack. My husband remained leaning against the desk, but his posture had changed slightly. One shoulder lowered, his weight resting more comfortably now, as if he had decided not to interrupt whatever this moment was becoming. Or perhaps he was waiting, watching. The thought made my pulse quicken. Beside me he hadn't stepped away like he said he would. If anything, he seemed more rooted to the spot now, as though leaving had become impossible. "You ever notice," he said quietly, his voice almost thoughtful, "how some moments stretch longer than they should?" No one answered immediately. I knew what he meant. Some moments arrive quietly and then refuse to end. They hover in the air, pulling people closer to truths they've been avoiding. I looked down at the desk again, but the papers there had long since lost their meaning. My focus drifted instead to the faint reflection in the polished wood. 3 blurred figures standing too close together. 3 lives brushing against a line none of us had planned to cross. "You're thinking too much," my husband said gently. I glanced up. His eyes were on me now, steady but not harsh. "I know that look," he added. A faint nervous breath escaped me before I could stop it. "And what does that look mean?" I asked. He studied me for a moment before answering. "It means you're standing in the middle of something you don't know how to name yet." The honesty of it struck deeper than I expected, because he wasn't wrong. I could feel the pull of 2 worlds colliding inside me, comfort and uncertainty, loyalty and curiosity, restraint and the strange thrill of a moment that felt dangerously alive. The man beside me shifted slightly, just a small movement, but it closed the distance between us by the smallest fraction, enough that I felt the warmth of his shoulder near mine. Neither of us looked at each other right away. Instead, the silence returned again, thicker this time. Then quietly, almost like a secret slipping into the room, he spoke. "Do you ever wonder," he said softly, "how different things could have been, if life had taken one turn a little differently?" The question hung in the air like a spark. I didn't answer immediately, because the truth was, I had wondered. Maybe not aloud, maybe not even consciously, but somewhere in the quiet corners of memory, the thought had existed. What if? I finally turned my head slightly. Our eyes met. For a moment the rest of the room faded away. No desk, no lamp, no watching presence, just a few feet away. Just that look. Raw, uncertain, honest in a way that words could never fully capture. His hand rested on the edge of the desk near mine again. Not touching, but close enough that I could feel the space between our fingers like a charged current. My breath slowed. He seemed to notice. His voice dropped even quieter. "I shouldn't have asked that, but you did," I replied. The words barely left my lips. Another silence followed. Not awkward, not tense, something deeper, something fragile. My husband shifted slightly behind the desk, but he didn't interrupt. If anything, his gaze softened, like someone witnessing a moment too honest to break. For a second, just one fleeting second, it felt like the distance between our hands might disappear, like one small movement could change everything. But neither of us moved. The space between our fingers remained electric, and the moment hovered there, balanced right on the edge of something that hadn't happened yet. Rain began quietly. At first it was only a faint tapping against the window of the study, soft enough that none of us noticed it right away. But slowly the sound grew steadier, wrapping the house in that familiar nighttime rhythm, the kind that makes the world outside fade away. The lamp on the desk was the only light left on. Everything beyond its warm circle had dissolved into shadows, and somehow, the silence between us had changed. It was no longer fragile, it felt inevitable. My husband stood near the bookshelf now, not watching with the same sharp intensity as before. Instead, his posture had softened, as if the long tension of the night had finally reached a quiet understanding that words would only complicate. Across the desk, the man beside me hadn't moved far either, but the distance between us had vanished without either of us noticing when it happened. The rain tapped steadily against the glass, filling the spaces where conversation once tried to live. "You hear that?" he said quietly. "The rain?" He shook his head slightly, a faint smile touching the corner of his lips. "No, the quiet." It was strange how a room full of emotions could feel so still. For a moment no one spoke again. Then I felt it. A hand brushing mine, not by accident this time. Just a gentle contact, warm and steady, like someone reaching out across a line that had finally faded. I didn't pull away, neither did he. The simple touch carried more meaning than any conversation we had tried to force earlier. My breath slowed, matching the calm rhythm of the rain outside. When I finally looked up at him, the uncertainty in his eyes had softened into something honest, something open, and something that had clearly been there long before tonight. "You don't have to say anything," he murmured. The quiet sincerity in his voice made my chest tighten. Because the truth was, there were too many things to say, too many emotions that had built quietly over time. Instead, the answer came in a different way. I stepped closer, not dramatically, not suddenly, just enough that the space between us disappeared entirely. For a second it felt like the entire room held its breath. His hand lifted slightly, resting gently against my arm. The touch was careful, almost reverent, like someone holding something fragile they didn't want to break. Outside, the rain fell harder, streaking silver lines across the dark window. The lamplight caught the quiet moment, two figures standing close enough to feel the warmth of each other's breath. And something shifted. My forehead brushed lightly against his, a small, almost hesitant contact, yet it carried the weight of everything we hadn't said. His breath slowed, mine did too. And in that quiet closeness, the tension that had followed us all night finally melted into something softer, something deeper. Our breaths blended together in the warm light. Our hands found each other again without hesitation. Not rushed, not desperate, just a quiet surrender to a feeling that had waited far too long. Across the room, my husband remained silent, his gaze thoughtful but calm, as if he understood that this moment wasn't about betrayal or victory. It was about truth finally stepping out of the shadows. The rain outside continued to fall. The lamp glowed softly over the desk, and in that quiet study, surrounded by the hush of night and the rhythm of distant thunder, 3 lives stood at the edge of something that could never return to what it had been before. Because sometimes the most powerful moments aren't loud. Morning arrived quietly. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving the windows covered in faint silver streaks that caught the pale light of the early sky. The house felt different now, calmer, almost too calm, as if the walls themselves were trying to absorb what had unfolded during the night. I woke slowly on the living room sofa, the soft gray light of morning stretching across the floorboards. For a moment I didn't move. Memories returned in fragments rather than a single clear picture. Soft lamplight, quiet breaths, the warmth of someone standing close enough to feel their heartbeat through silence. Nothing about the night had been loud, and yet it had changed everything. I sat up slowly, pulling the thin blanket around my shoulders. The study door across the hallway was slightly open, the lamp inside now turned off, the desk barely visible in the fading shadows. The house was still, too still. Footsteps came from the kitchen. I turned slightly and saw my husband standing by the counter, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. His back was to me, but his posture looked the same as always, calm, steady, composed in that quiet way that had always grounded the room. For a second I wondered if he had slept at all. "You're awake," he said without turning. His voice wasn't cold, but it wasn't light either, just honest. "I guess I am," I replied softly. He turned then, holding one of the mugs out toward me. Steam curled gently upward between us. Our fingers brushed as I took it. Neither of us pulled away quickly. The moment lingered for half a second before we both stepped back. "Did he leave?" I asked quietly. My husband leaned against the counter, taking a slow sip from his own cup. "Early," he said. The single word held more meaning than it should have. The silence returned again. But this time it felt different, less electric, more reflective. Like the quiet after a storm when everything still feels damp and uncertain. "I didn't expect last night to happen," I said carefully. He nodded once, staring down into his coffee. Neither did I. There was no anger in his voice. If anything, there was something closer to thoughtfulness, which somehow made the guilt settle heavier in my chest. "I don't know what it meant," I admitted. The words felt fragile, but they were the truth. He looked up then, really looked at me. "That's the part that matters most," he said. The statement confused me. Before I could ask what he meant, the front door suddenly knocked. Once, twice. The sound echoed through the quiet house. Both of us turned toward it instinctively. My husband set his mug down slowly. "Were you expecting someone?" I asked. He shook his head. The knock came again, this time firmer. He walked to the door while I stood frozen near the sofa, my thoughts racing with strange possibilities. When the door opened, a familiar voice drifted into the hallway. "I hope I'm not interrupting." It was him, standing on the front step. The morning sunlight behind him made his expression difficult to read, but there was something different in his posture now. Less uncertainty, more quiet resolve. My husband stepped aside without hesitation. "Come in," he said calmly. For a moment all three of us stood there again, just like the night before. But the tension had changed, because now we all knew something real had passed between us, something impossible to pretend away. And whatever this connection truly was, it was only beginning to reveal itself. Morning sunlight slowly filled the room, soft and patient, like it had all the time in the world to reveal what the night had left behind. The three of us stood in the quiet space near the doorway, the air no longer heavy with the same electric tension that had pulsed through the house hours earlier. Instead, something quieter lived there now, something thoughtful, something honest. He stepped inside slowly, closing the door behind him. The sound of the latch clicking shut echoed lightly through the room, marking a strange kind of beginning. For a moment none of us spoke. I studied his face in the daylight. The uncertainty that had followed him the night before hadn't completely disappeared, but it had softened into something calmer, like someone who had finally decided to stop running from a truth he didn't fully understand yet. "I didn't like leaving like that," he said gently. My husband leaned against the kitchen counter again, arms loosely crossed. His expression wasn't guarded anymore, but it wasn't simple either. It carried the quiet complexity of someone who had spent the night thinking deeply. "Most people don't come back the next morning," he replied. There was no bitterness in his voice, just observation. He nodded slightly, accepting the weight of that statement. "I know," he said. The silence returned again, but it didn't feel uncomfortable anymore. It felt like space, room for thoughts that needed time to settle. I stepped a little closer to them both. The morning light caught the faint reflection in the window behind us. Three figures standing in the same room again, but somehow changed. "What happened last night?" I began softly. My voice trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence, because there wasn't a single word that could define it. Not betrayal, not romance, not escape. My husband answered quietly before I could search any further. "It happened because something between you two has existed longer than any of us wanted to admit." His honesty landed gently but firmly. The other man lowered his gaze for a moment, then looked back up again. "I never meant for it to become this complicated," he admitted. A faint smile appeared on my husband's face. Life doesn't ask permission before becoming complicated. The tension that had once lived between them had softened into something almost respectful now. Two men acknowledging a truth that couldn't be ignored. I stepped closer to my husband first. He looked at me carefully as I reached for his hand. His fingers closed around mine without hesitation, grounding me the way they always had. Then I looked toward the other man. The connection between us was still there, quiet, unmistakable. But it felt different in the morning light, less like a storm and more like a memory waiting to be understood. He seemed to recognize that too. A small, understanding smile touched his lips. "Some things," he said softly, "don't have to last forever to mean something." The words lingered in the room like a final note of music. I stepped forward and embraced him briefly, a simple hug that carried the warmth of everything we hadn't fully said. When we pulled apart, the moment felt complete rather than unfinished. He nodded once to my husband, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Then he walked toward the door. Sunlight flooded the hallway as it opened. Before stepping outside, he paused and looked back once more, not with regret, but with gratitude. The door closed quietly behind him. My husband stepped closer to me, resting his forehead lightly against mine. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. Some stories don't end with dramatic declarations. Sometimes they end with two people choosing peace, while the memory of a single unforgettable night lingers like a quiet perfume in the air. And somehow, that was enough.